Yes, I'm looking at you, King James version of the Bible. There is nothing especially holy or accurate about the King James version of the Bible, especially the 1611 or whatever it is, special ones that people want to mark out. Hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and former university professor, and this is my third episode in a series on how to be a cult leader.
Created in my own image.
These videos are derived from Anthony Pratkanis and Elliot Aronson's Age of Propaganda, a book from the early 2000s. And from their work, I've derived about 12 sort of tips for how to be a cult leader. But in this episode, I'm not going to rehearse those. I did those in the previous two videos. Instead, what I'd like to do is your church looking a little bit culty. Is it becoming a cult? Or does it showing signs of being a cult? And this is going to make some people a little uncomfortable, and I mean to make you a little uncomfortable. But really, I'm expressing this out of concern that some churches, maybe unknowingly, are drifting into cult land. And it would be helpful for them to be aware if they're doing that, and us to be aware if some church, even if it's well-meaning, has started drifting off into a cult-like direction. To remind you, one of the points that I made on the first video in this series when I was explaining what these 12 different sort of tips for being a cult leader are is that lots of religious organizations, military units, even sports teams and other kinds of groups use these social and psychological kinds of mechanisms for forming tight-knit communities, for shaping opinion, for persuasion. And doing so doesn't make you a cult. And so we shouldn't be surprised that successful religious organizations show some of the signs, that some of the techniques of being a cult leader. What should make us uncomfortable is if they're kind of going too far. If you imagine there was a checklist of how to be a cult leader and they're getting high marks consistently on way too many of these, then we should start feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And so let me give you a few examples of just signs that maybe you're starting to drift a little bit too much into a cult kind of space. First, playing off of that idea of creating your own social reality. Does your church or does your ministry or your organization use a little bit too much, which you might think of insider language, even language that the insiders themselves don't understand?
But I'm only allowed to recommend one name for the STOASRCEIUEO.
And you don't think the acronym's just a little clunky?
I know, it was quite catchy.
So what I have in mind here is what's sometimes called Christianese or in-group jargon.
Speaking things, we don't know what, it's out of context. We get it. Other people don't get it. I saw this girl, her Instagram profile, her bio said, "Taste and see that he is good."
It's that kind of language that if you haven't been around for a while, you don't know what they're talking about. Or why are they talking funny this way? And even if you have been around and you're asked, what exactly does that mean? You may not know. Now, some insider jargon is just part of any kind of specialty community or a body of knowledge. Horse trainers are going to have special terms that have to do with training horses. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about language that we don't even need, that all it seems to be doing is marking us off as an in-group as opposed to an out-group. It's creating a new social reality. So, like archaic language that we don't really use or understand anymore. Yes, I'm looking at you, King James version of the Bible. There is nothing especially holy or accurate about the King James version of the Bible, especially the 1611 or whatever it is, special ones that people want to mark out. It just happens to be a very early one, but that doesn't mean that it is most authoritative. It doesn't mean it's based on the best texts. It doesn't mean it's closest to God in some way. In fact, what it is hard to understand because we don't use that language anymore. We don't use words like abide in the sense of living or dwelling in, or magnify, or unto, or thou, or thine. So if you're in a church that's using a lot of that language, apparently unnecessarily, even outside of sort of poetic worship songs and things like that, Maybe that's a concern. Or maybe it's using not English, Hebrew words like Jehovah, Jireh, El Shaddai, or Greek words like koinonia, agape, Latin words like sensus divinitatis, ecclesia, and others. Of course, a little bit sometimes is useful if it opens up your imagination and is a good teaching point. But if we're using that kind of language all the time and other unusual words and phrases like fellowship, atonement, sanctification, the word, hedge of protection, traveling mercies, ancient of days, and people themselves who have been there for decades don't know what these words mean, well, then that's not communicating clearly in terms of content or substance. What it's doing is marking out who are insiders and who are outsiders.
Gina, you're wearing sweatpants. It's Monday.
So?
So that's against the rules, and you can't sit with us.
Whatever. Those rules aren't real.
That insider language can be a way to reinforce this alternate reality and exercise thought control, frankly.
Yes? You'd like to invite me in?
Absolutely.
So that's worrisome. Is there too much of this insider language that is completely unnecessary? Second question you could ask about whether a church is getting a little too cultish. Is there a number of absolute taboos concerning things like food or drink or other kinds of things that you consume or things that you do, especially ones that are out of step with biblical theology? So what about caffeine, alcohol consumption, meat, tobacco? None of those are forbidden in the Bible. Excesses of them, or almost anything else, are problematic. Addiction is definitely problematic. Getting drunk all the time, definitely problematic. But the Bible does not say don't drink alcohol. The Bible does not say don't smoke tobacco or chew tobacco. The Bible doesn't say don't eat meat. The Bible doesn't tell Christians today to not consume caffeine or whatever it is. If we start reading in taboos that aren't even there, we are adding to the gospel message. And that's actually forbidden in the Bible itself. But these are the kinds of things that cults tend to do to start shaping that social reality and creating these strong boundaries of us versus them. So be on the lookout for these really absolute taboos of that sort. Third thing to keep an eye on, or a question to ask, is, are members relying too heavily on a small leadership group of leaders for getting things right theologically and behaviorally in terms of their own lives? Are you being instead taught to think critically, to figure things out, to discuss widely with other people in the congregation, with other people you trust, certain ideas? Or are members of the church being somehow taught that to think carefully or critically or to talk to outsiders is somehow being hateful or sinful? I'm not just making things up. I've been associated and sort of interacted with people from churches who really do seem to think that if you have any questions about what the pastor just said, like, I don't understand what he meant about such and such, well, don't be hateful. That's not hateful. It's being curious. But if you start being told that it's being hateful, then that self-censorship starts creeping in, and we're definitely getting into a culty sort of zone here. Fourth question: are the sources of truth for the community being narrowed too much? Oftentimes, just the Bible. But what that usually means when we say the Bible is the only way to know what is true, usually that means the Bible as interpreted by who? This church's leadership. Because there are other perfectly legitimate interpretations of the Bible that they would reject and say, you're not just accepting the Bible's teaching, even though somebody else would say, yeah, you were. Well, that's getting, again, into that controlling of the worldview and the mindset in a really rigid kind of way that starts to bear the signs of what cults do. If you start hearing things like anything you need to know for life is in the Bible, beware, because that's not in the Bible. The Bible never says it. And in fact, we see even in, for instance, the Old Testament, when the tabernacle is constructed or the temple is constructed, this reliance on skilled artisans and other kinds of knowledgeable experts to bring their expertise to that task. And yet that expertise of theirs is not recorded in the Bible, if you see what I mean. It can't be off bounds then to rely on that kind of expertise. Likewise, when Solomon is given wisdom to govern Israel in the Old Testament, he's given part of that wisdom is knowledge about the plants and animals and other types of things. In fact, we're told in the biblical text that leaders from other places and lots of people wanted to come and hear him talk about those kinds of things, not just cutting babies in half, but and other judicial kinds of governance issues, but his knowledge of the natural world. But that knowledge of the natural world, which Solomon apparently had been gifted from God, is not recorded in the Bible. And so, of course, there is extra biblical wisdom out there. We sometimes talk about it in the Christian theological tradition as the book of nature that is worth studying and investigating. But all of that stuff, the kind of stuff you would read about in, I don't know, a text about what are the local plants and animals where you live and how to eat nutritiously for your body where you are today, or contemporary medical knowledge, or whatever it is, those things aren't recorded in the Bible. And so if you start getting into a religious context where they're saying the only thing you need to know is in the Bible, if you were creative enough to find it, you're probably drifting into cult territory and should be careful. Fifth, church leadership is trying to control all gatherings. Okay, that's something that cults often do, is they have to have their inside elite band controlling everything. Well, if your church leadership is trying to control all gatherings of Christians within that community, or all members of that community, that's about power and control, not about enabling the growth of the people in the church or respecting congregants' relationships with God outside of what is mediated by the leadership. That's looking like cult-like behavior. Sixth, manipulative worship practices. I'm afraid that in some segments of the church, these are becoming more common. The worship leaders aren't inviting people to worship, to sing, to raise hands, but demanding it. I was in a church once that I think these were well-meaning folks, but the pastor actually criticized how, or talked down to people for how they were worshiping, like they were doing it wrong because they weren't spirited enough, or they weren't clapping enough, or weren't singing forcefully enough. Well, it's never a worship leader's job to criticize how people are worshiping. That's starting to be manipulative. Or heavy use of empty repetition instead of meaningful emphasis in singing. So there are certain phrases, words and phrases in worship songs that deserve to be repeated. Like if you're singing praises to God, you could repeat how great you are, we love you, repeatedly. But if you're repeating phrases like rain down, fall down on us, shine, or things like that, something else is going on. That's not focusing on God. That's focusing on us, or maybe the worship experience. Add to that production that's disorienting because it's smoke machines, bright flashing and changing lights, or other kinds of distortion techniques that make it hard to focus your attention, hard to concentrate. Well, that makes things less clear instead of focusing. Those are techniques for deactivating our reasoning processes and for inducing altered states of consciousness. That's cult-like kind of behavior and should be used very, very cautiously, if at all. Seventh, manipulative appeals for money. This might be the biggest one.
Why didn't I know there was gold in the sun? I'll get that too before I'm done. Yes, I will.
That really, I mentioned before that one of the clearest signs of something being a cult is not just the use of all these techniques, but the use of these various techniques in order to get people to give money, basically, or time, effort, and manipulative appeals for money, even from those who are financially struggling, telling them they should be giving to the church, even when they're financially struggling. And clearly the church leadership is not financially struggling. That's a serious red flag. Another example of this is not allowing for offerings to sort of count, or to count toward your generosity, or to be a sign of your devotion to God if those offerings are going outside of the church. Like caring for, I don't know, widows, orphans, and the poor, which is what we're commanded to be generous towards, to support. Biblically, that's what Jesus modeled, was taking care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, and those sorts of people, not give to a wealthy institution to make it more wealthy. Pastors sometimes try to make themselves parallel to either Old Testament Levites or New Testament traveling apostles when they're really neither. Then they may add on to this a prosperity kind of gospel that somehow giving money guarantees that you're going to get money back. The Bible does not promise this. That is not the gospel. That is something else, and it's manipulative and dangerous. It's unhealthy. Finally, eighth sign that a church might be drifting into a cult kind of direction is constantly making churchgoers feel like they're lacking or failing unless they are doing more and more for the church, that they're dependent upon the church to address their failures, that they're dependent upon this organization that's chartered, that's official, that's a government recognized entity to be an intermediary between them and God. That is how they find their way to God, is through this organization. And other organizations don't count. And other communities don't count, even other communities of Christians. That's dangerous business. That's that chasing a phantom that I mentioned in the previous videos. It's not the gospel. Jesus has already done the saving work for us, and by the Holy Spirit will complete that work in us. Christ followers are the church. We're not needing a human organization that's legally recognized to act as that intermediary between us and God. That's not the gospel. That's moving into cult zone. I know this is going to bother some people. Leave your questions, comments. If you think I've gone too far and I need to be corrected, that's okay too. But, you better bring the goods, because I've been thinking long and hard about this stuff for a long time. And I'm sharing it, again, out of a place of care and concern that I'm seeing too much of this stuff in churches that I think start in some really well-meaning places, but they very quickly drift into some very dangerous places because, frankly, they're using too many of the techniques in how to be a cult leader. Thanks for joining me. Sorry I have to be so sober and somber in this particular bit of material. But as always, leave comments, suggestions for things that you'd like to hear me talk about. And in the meantime, try to avoid those cults out there. See you next time. Bye for now.
Throw down your weapons and put your hands on your head, or I'll turn you all into burning bushes.